Hello students, in Unit 1.4a we will be focusing on taxes and how they impact the market and its stakeholders. Taxes have a significant effect on markets because they alter product prices by creating a wedge between the amount consumers pay and the amount sellers receive. This in turn prevents market equilibrium from being achieved, leading to inefficiency in the market. Taxes can be divided into two categories. Direct taxes are those imposed on people and usually their income, whereas indirect taxes or excise taxes are imposed on expenditure. Excise taxes are levied on specific goods and services such as gasoline or wine. The model of supply and demand, illustrated earlier, and the concepts of consumer and producer surplus are used to identify the potential inefficiencies associated with taxes, but we will discuss this more in depth later. It should be highlighted that because an indirect tax is a tax on expenditure, it can be imposed on the expenditure of both firms and households. When households buy goods and services in the product market, it's called consumption spending. And when firms when firms invest in factors of production in the resource market, it's called investment spending. Indirect taxes can be levied against the investment expenditures of the firms as well as the consumption expenditures of the households. Because of this, an indirect tax in the business sector adds an extra cost to the producer. Therefore, it forces a leftward shift of the supply curve, as the following model illustrates. As you can see in the model, an indirect tax is placed on top of the selling price, hence raising the product's price and reducing the quantity demanded. The reason for the tax shifting supply instead of demand is simple. It comes down to what's called the statutory incidence. The statutory incidence, or burden, of a tax refers to which party has the legal obligation to pay the tax. For example, the incidence of a sales tax on many products is on the firm because the seller is legally responsible for collecting the tax and allocating that tax to the government. As a consumer, you may feel that you are the one who actually pays the tax, because the amount is added to the price when you pay for your purchases. And this leads you to consider the economic incidence or economic burden. And this typically differs from the statutory incidence. Often, consumers bear at least part of the economic burden of taxes in the form of higher prices of goods and services. Economic analysis is used to predict what percentage of the economic burden of the tax falls on the buyers and what percentage falls on the sellers. The answer, as we will see, usually depends on the elasticities of demand and supply. So simply put, the tax incidence is a measure of the consequences of a tax on all of the affected parties, like the producers, consumers, and the government receiving the tax revenue. Tax impacts the profitability of any product, of which the degree may vary. Think about the different market structures. Whoever pays the tax suffers the tax burden or has the greater incidence of the tax. An excise tax can be a per unit flat or specific tax, which is a fixed amount of tax per unit of the good or service sold. For example, let's consider $5 taxes or a $5 tax per pack of cigarettes. Because of this, a flat or specific tax will cause a parallel shift in the supply curve. This is because the marginal cost of selling the cigarettes is taxed at a fixed price of $5, regardless of the quantity demanded. This means no matter what the price at any given quantity sold, the tax will be an additional $5 per unit. Or we could also consider an excise tax called ad valorem tax. An ad valorem, which means according to value, and is an indirect tax, which is expressed as a fixed percentage of the sales price. So with an ad valorem tax, a sales price as sales price increases, so too does the value of the tax. For example, the sales tax in some Texas cities is 8.25% of the price of the taxable commodity. The taxed supply line diverges from the origin, as 8.25% of a sales price of 200 units will be much greater than the sales price of just 20 units. For emphasis, a tax will lead toward an increase in price. taxes shift supply to the left, which raises the equilibrium price of the product, and therefore the opportunity cost for consumption. As shown, due to the statutory incidence of tax falling on the firm, supply shifts from S1 to S2, leading to a rise in price as supply becomes more scarce. An increase in tax also reduces the output of the firm, as a greater percentage of the revenue is going to the government instead of being reinvested into the production process or invested into research and development to make production cheaper in the long run. Decreases in supply raises the equilibrium price from P1 to P2 and decreases the quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. Taxes also tend to shrink the market in the short run. Remember that the statutory incidence falls on the firm. This means while producers and consumers both contribute to the cost of the tax, firms are legally required to pay it to the government. This creates a higher opportunity cost for doing business as the tax increases the cost of each product sold, ceteris paribus. As a consequence, there will be a decrease in supply, which in turn causes an increase in the equilibrium price from P1 to P2. The higher price causes a contraction in quantity demanded from Q1 to Q2. This contraction in market size might pose an unemployment problem, as the most efficient way firms can adjust for incidence of tax is to lay off labor. While the firm has the statutory incidence, the economic incidence of tax can be distributed amongst the firms and household sectors by increasing the price of the firm's products. The producer, usually, does not pass the entire tax burden to the consumer. Why is this the case? Because the producer realizes that an increase in the price will result in reduced quantity demanded, which is the law of demand, as their consumers will look for cheaper substitutes and are also less willing and able to purchase your product, thereby diminishing the firm's revenue stream. Because of all this, the tax is usually subdivided into two parts: the consumer's incidence and the producer's incidence. Remember consumer and producer surplus from our unit on the price mechanism and market efficiency? Well, let's analyze how a tax makes the market function more inefficiently and how the tax affects producers and consumer surplus. When the government levies a tax, consumers suffer as consumers pay higher prices and receive less of the product. As we can see in the model, prior to the tax being levied, consumers enjoy a large surplus, represented by the area in red, when purchasing Q amounts of the product at P prices. However, after a tax is introduced to the market, a new price that consumers pay is set at PC, where the taxed supply line intersects the demand curve. As a result of this higher price, due to the implementation of the tax, quantity demanded falls from Q to QT, as opportunity cost of the consumption of this product rises. The green area represents the consumer's incidence of tax, while the brown triangle represents the loss of consumer surplus as consumers pay higher prices for lower quantities. Producers also suffer from a tax as producers incur extra cost, produce less, and are less likely to make profit. Here, in a free market situation, producers obtain maximum profit, known as producer surplus, when selling Q amounts of their product at P prices. Producer surplus, i.e. their profits, are represented by the green triangle, while a combination of the green and pink triangles form the revenue box. Don't forget the difference between revenue and profit. But let's just focus on how a tax impacts producer surplus for a moment. After the tax is levied in the market, shifting supply from S to S taxed, consumers are only willing to purchase QT amounts of the product. Therefore, producers must lower their quantity supplied in the market from Q to QT in order to avoid producing a surplus of the product, which will lead to market inefficiency and wasted production for the producer, and wasted investments as well. This also means in order to maximize their profits, producers must lower the price of their products to keep customers interested in purchasing QT amounts of the product. So the price producers receive for selling this product falls from P to PP. The orange box represents producer tax incidence, while the red triangle represents the loss to producer surplus following the tax. So in order to maximize their profits, represented by surplus in green, producers must lower the quantity supplied to QT. The only beneficiary of a tax in the immediate short run is government, as the tax collected will increase government revenue streams. So let's break this down step by step. Here we have a free market situation where equilibrium is reached and producer and consumers are benefiting equally from their market interaction. Then the government decides to impose a tax. Because of the statutory incidence, the producer is legally responsible for paying the tax, consequently shifting the supply curve to the left from S to S1, as the tax increases the opportunity cost of investments for the firm, thereby diminishing supply. As a consequence, the supply becomes more scarce, leading to a rise in price so as to avoid a shortage and market inefficiency. Due to the rise in price, consumers are less willing and able to purchase the good at QE, so quantity demand falls to QT for quantity taxed. Remember, on the model, that consumer surplus is defined as the area above the price line and below the demand line. Because of the tax increases the price of the product the firm is willing to sell to the consumer, consumer surplus shrinks to the area in blue, as consumers have to purchase a smaller quantity at a greater price, which translates to an increase in the opportunity cost for the consumption of this product. Is the price that the consumer must pay. What? PC then represents the price that the consumer must pay, because the producer also somewhat is responsible for paying the value of the tax. Producer surplus will decline as well. As producer surplus is defined as the area below the price and above the supply line. Because the price the producer receives has changed, so too has the producer surplus, or the producer's profits. The yellow box represents the consumer incidence of tax, and the red box represents the producer incidence of tax. So combined together to make the tan box, which represents overall government revenue, whose value can be determined by calculating the area of the square, which is equal to PC minus PP times quantity taxed. This is equal to government revenue. The yellow triangle represents the loss to consumer surplus, and the red triangle represents the loss to the producer surplus, which combined together are referred to as deadweight loss. Deadweight loss is the loss of welfare, or the loss of utility, or the loss of profit or benefit for market participants. It results from taxes or other protectionist policies or other externalities, which we'll get to in Chapter 5. The deadweight loss of a tax will depend on two factors: the size of the tax and the reduction in the quantity sold. The reduction in the quantity sold will depend on the elasticity of demand and the elasticity of supply. The more elastic demand or supply is, the larger the deadweight loss will be. If either demand or supply is price inelastic, then the deadweight loss will be small and could even be zero if perfectly inelastic. When price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply are similar, consumers and producers share the burden of the tax equally. Consumers pay more and receive less output. Consumers and producers' surplus decline equally in all likelihood, and therefore market size was reduced from QE to Q taxed. But what happens to the consumer and producer tax burdens when demand is inelastic or elastic? Let's explore. When demand is more elastic than supply, consumers are more responsive to changes in price, and therefore less tolerant of price increases. This is due to the determinants of supply and demand. Perhaps there are many substitutes, or the product is not a necessary one. Because of this, producers may pay more of the burden of the tax, as placing the majority of the tax burden on the consumers may drive them out of the market completely or drive them to the competitors. Government receives less revenue than when price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply are equal. Market size decreases quite significantly. Therefore, employment is more likely to decline as the market size declines, ceteris paribus. deadweight loss is greater due to large decreases in quantity. When PED is less than PES, consumers are relatively indifferent to price changes due to the determinants of inelasticity of demand, such as necessities. Consumers' tax burden is greater than producers as a result. Government receives more revenue as these products are inelastic for consumers, and therefore they will pay the higher price regardless because they might be addicted in the case of cigarettes, the product might be a necessity in the case of EpiPens, or they might have brand loyalty like in the case of Under Armour athletic apparel. But also, because of this inelastic demand for consumers, market size decreases relatively little. Therefore, employment is less affected and deadweight loss is minimized. For example, when a specific tax is levied on petrol or gasoline, consumers will have the greatest tax incidence, as gasoline is usually a necessity for transportation, distribution, and commuting. As a result, deadweight loss is minimized and as consumers bear the brunt of the tax burden. The more elastic the demand relative to supply, the greater the burden paid by the producers, the greater the deadweight loss, and the smaller the government revenue. So if the government wants to maximize its revenue from the tax, they will tax inelastic products. The more inelastic the demand relative to supply, the greater the burden paid by consumers, the smaller the deadweight loss, and the greater the government revenue. Take a moment to analyze this model and try to determine what the areas represent. If a tax was imposed, what would A and B represent? Without a tax, what would A, B, and C represent? All right, see if you can pause this video and just roll it over in your head, and we'll discuss it in class. Same thing here. Think about deadweight loss, and we'll discuss in class. All right, see you guys next time.